I'm going to, before I have John Hankinson introduce our keynote speaker, I thought I ought to step up here very briefly and say a word about John. One of the questions that people always have about these sessions, you come, you hear all the experts, and the question is, what difference does it make? Well, what we try to do is to have the people who are going to go away from these sessions and use the information involved in these sessions. And today, we have achieved that to the absolute perfect level. John Hankinson is the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Restoration Task Force. So John is the person that has been tasked by Lisa Jackson and the administration to head the government-wide effort to develop the restoration plan for the entire Gulf of Mexico. So he is the person who is in the hot seat. And my favorite toy at the moment is my new iPad, and so I'm sitting in the front row 2 seconds ago, and I call up the executive order that has given John his marching orders. He has to coordinate the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Transportation, EPA, OMB, CEQ, OSTP, the Domestic Policy Council, and other executive departments, agencies, and institutions. John, good luck. So on that note, I should also say that John was the regional administrator for EPA in the Southeast, and he is a native Floridian, so he is from the area. He knows the Gulf Coast very, very well, and so he's the perfect person, I think, to take on this task, and the perfect person to introduce our keynote speaker, and immediately after that, to moderate our restoration panel. So thank you, John.
When you put it that way, Pete, I don't know if I want to do this or not, you know. But Pete left out 5 very important members of our task force, and that's the 5 states in the Gulf who have already underway of some very important restoration activities. But I'm really looking forward to managing and supporting this task force. I'm getting staff from all of those agencies that Pete mentioned help work with us on this. I'm getting great support from all the stakeholders, because if you read the executive order, which I encourage you to do several times, I read it every night before I go to sleep, it's very much to be driven from the bottom up, from the stakeholders, from the folks who live in the Gulf, and we're going to endeavor to do that as best we can, and I think it's going to be a good marriage between the people of the Gulf and the states and the federal agencies and all the groups that really care about this wonderful water body. So, well, I'm not, they didn't pay me to do a speech today. I have a much more delightful task, which is to introduce Chip Grote and then to moderate our panel on restoration. I don't know if the name tags have been changed out over there. You want to do that while we're very pleased to have Chip Grote give our keynote addressing restoration plan for the Gulf of Mexico. Chip is with the Director of the Center for International Energy and Environmental Policy at the University of Texas. As a Gator, Chip, thanks so much. We really enjoy our new coach, Will Muschamp. He's no longer a coach in waiting. He's actually a head coach. So I just had to get that in. But Chip has a tremendous amount of scientific experience. He was the head of the USGS for a number of years, and really championed this approach of an integrated scientific approach to restoration while he was at USGS. He also served as a Louisiana State geologist and directed the Coastal Zone Management Program there and stressed protection of the important coastal resources there in Louisiana. He has also served on the Outer Continental Shelf Policy Committee. That's easy to say. And a word that I've never ever used in public His work includes resource and infrastructure development impacts on natural systems and the restoration ecology of these systems, desert, coastal, and fluvial systems, encompassing the evolution of landforms and the physical stratigraphy, forget it, of deposits and etc. Anyway, you get it. I'm not a scientist, you understand. But my son, who is larger than I am, by the way, is working on his master's in ecology at the University of Florida, so I hope y'all get a chance to meet him sometime. He's an excellent bass player. You get me with a harmonica, and we got 2/3 of a band anyway. So, Chip, with that introduction, I'm sorry I kind of just kind of mangled it for you, but I'm sure you're going to do quite well with our plenary to get our restoration discussion off and going.
John, I'm not always sure what I do either, so thank you. I can't believe we've come this far, 2/3 of a day in a major conference, and we haven't yet seen a PowerPoint. Are you ready for some PowerPoint? I am going to show you some pictures. In fact, I think rather than a keynote, this is more of a responsibility to show in pictures some of the things that the last panel discussed, and hopefully be a segue into what you'll hear from the panel that John's going to lead about restoration. So let me begin then by, some might argue, splitting hairs. There are some differences between cleanup and restoration, because removing the oil is cleanup. Now, you could argue that it's very likely that most restoration efforts will be preceded by removing oil, particularly in shallow waters, coastal marsh areas. But the removal of the oil, the cleanup itself, does not constitute restoration of the habitats to the degree that we think of restoring those habitats to pre-spill conditions or to the productivity or delivering the services that we expected from them prior to an oil spill. And when we talk about restoration, we have to recognize that there is a significant difference between restoring beaches and wetlands and restoring deep Gulf areas, whether it's the water column or the bottom. In fact, one could discuss seriously whether or not cleanup beyond what's done initially in the face of the catastrophe and the efforts to stop the oil from spreading and the efforts to remove it as it emerges, whether it's from a tanker or a well, once we pass that stage of cleanup, how much cleanup actually is part of the restoration process after that? In other words, are we going to go back into the wetlands now and deal with the oil that's still there and eventually try to clean it up, to remove it? Is there any way we're going to go into the water column of the Gulf of Mexico or the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico where there may or may not be residual oil and actually clean it up? So when we talk about restoration, then we have to understand where we're going from a cleanup situation to a situation where we're really trying to restore the productivity of natural or human ecosystems. There's probably not a number related to the spill or response to it or what's going to follow that isn't debated in some circles, or particularly scientific circles. And I present these numbers, these chiseled in stone to some. We see them often, 4.9 million barrels, but even those numbers will likely be contested in court, if nowhere else, because I think BP is of a different opinion as to how much oil actually entered the system and how much is still there. Just to illustrate what the panel was talking about and what Ed Overton and others were pointing out is, where did the oil go? Well, we know there was a certain amount that was cleaned up in the sense that it was skimmed, it was retrieved, it was recovered as it emerged from the well itself in the later stages. And there's a certain amount of oil, about 42% residual oil and naturally dispersed oil, that theoretically at least is still out there somewhere. Whether out there means in the water column in the Gulf, whether out there means on the beaches or in the wetlands. So we're dealing still with a significant amount of oil that's in the natural system somewhere. Do we know where it is? Again, I think this panel preceding this talk pointed out very clearly we don't know nearly as much about it as we'd like to, and we don't have a very good history of learning that out, of learning that kind of information. Just to illustrate the oil that reached the surface in the Gulf and what it looked like and the efforts that were made to skim it. The goo that was referred to, the oil that is not the black, clean kind that most people think of, but the moussey kind of oil. And when we talk about cleanup as an initial stage to restoration, we have to be aware there's a fair amount of controversy surrounding cleanup processes themselves, whether they themselves have a significant effect. We remember the Exxon Valdez, and yes, there was interest in removing that clearly present black oil from the sound, but there was an awful lot of discussion about whether or not the process itself, pressurized steamed waters on those cold water habitats, and when the oil was released, where it went, as to whether that was more of a cleanup or restoration effort, or whether it was more additional damage to the systems that were being cleaned up. And when we see oil on a beach, on the surface, is there an acceptable way to remove that oil, to clean up that oil that will not be more damaging to the environment and the habitat that it coats or that it sits upon? So that's why I asked the question earlier. Now that we've reached the point where we've skimmed and retrieved and recovered the oil that was emerging, are we ever going to go back and actually clean up the oil that's there? Or do we look at restoration in another sense, restoring a habitat that may at the present time be oil? And I use this as a bit of a casual statement, but when we talked about cleanup, other than the skimming of the oil and the capture of the oil, what was done to the oil that actually got into the marsh, we saw a lot of newsreels of folks out there with essentially paper towels trying to wipe off the oil off the various kinds of vegetation out there. And so that just points out the difficulty compared to the rocks of Prince William Sound of trying to remove and then begin restoring then the muddy, sandy kinds of environments that we find in Louisiana and other parts of the Gulf of Mexico. There are not effective ways really to do that. So we end up with some oiled marshes, as was pointed out earlier, particularly the 100 miles west of the Mississippi River in the Barataria Bay area, where there is still a significant amount of oil on the beaches and in the wetlands area. And this is a common shot of what it looks like entering the wetlands, that at a certain level you see the oil attached to the marsh vegetation, and that's the way it remains today. Billy Nungasser, who referenced to local officials earlier, is a well-known figure in Louisiana and very outspoken, is one that's happy to point out where the oil is. And so there is still oil in the system that people can see 30 to 40 feet out. The tide is out. He said there's no mechanism to clean that up thus far. So Mr. Nungasser and other local officials are certainly concerned about the oil that's been identified and that the oil that has not been removed. And then again, probably debated by some in the scientific community, the fact that bacteria quickly disposed of methane from a BP incident, an article that was in Science, pointing out, as was referred to earlier, there are lots of bacteria in the Gulf of Mexico who like hydrocarbons, and were they this efficient in gobbling up the methane, and are we in fact at a very reduced stage of methane presence in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico? There are official restoration efforts. Peter referred to one, and I'll begin with the natural resource damage assessment. Clearly, this is an orchestrated process involving the trustees, those who are charged with being responsible for the resources there, the living and human resources. Teams of people from the federal government, state government, and BP itself will spend several months and even years looking at areas impacted by the oil, determining what the damages were, determining what natural services provided by those habitats have been interrupted and who've been injured by those interruptions of services. And on the basis of those evaluations, agreed to presumably by all the parties, damages will be assessed. And in this case, we know who's going to pay. This is intended to be paid for by the responsible party for the spill, so presumably this will be a bill that will be largely paid by BP. And it implies that it will involve restoration in the sense that habitats will be restored. But are we really talking more about restoration of damages to people and to systems in a monetary sense than we are a physical restoration process? And then, as Peter mentioned in introducing John, the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force, chaired by the EPA Administrator, has been charged with a very broad and comprehensive multi-agency, state, federal, stakeholder involvement in looking at a restoration plan for the Gulf of Mexico. This implies a very, very comprehensive look at damages to the Gulf, certainly hinged on the BP Macondo spill, but I'm sure other damages will creep under the magnifying glass as this task force works through its efforts to determine what kind of restoration plan is appropriate for this distressed Gulf system.